Hello everyone, salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today's topic is a little different than what we usually are engaged in. Today we have a history lesson from entire probably Eastern world before the West, the rise and fall of Eastern world orders. And the speaker is a very well-known professor of international relations, Professor Ayse Zarakol from the University of Cambridge, and she's a fellow at Emmanuel College. She has her earlier education here in the United States and graduated and did the PhD from University of Wisconsin and back to Cambridge. She's a citizen of Turkey, UK, as well as United States. So that's a very broad citizenship range. That's very good to know. And so welcome you all, and a formal introductory remarks, and later the concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Lucas de Olivier Pez, who is a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. And his he has a PhD in politics and international relations from the University of Cambridge, and his focus is on the hierarchy, dynamics of order, hierarchy, sovereignty, regionalism, and international relations. So welcome you all, and now I invite Dr. Price for the introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, to my introduction. It is my pleasure to be introducing my supervisor, a PhD and a great mentor and a fantastic scholar, Professor Ayse Zarakol, and also to see her book being discussed in another event, reaching a progressively broader audience. I think this speaks to the impact that her book is making. So let me just introduce you a bit of Dr. Zarakol's broader contribution in history and biography. So she's a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge, and also a fellow of the Emmanuel College, as has been said just now. And she's an associate editor of the International Organizations Journal. Professor Zarakol has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and has been working as a lecturer and then reader and professor at the University of Cambridge since 2013. After moving from a position, a tenure track position in the University of Washington Lee in Virginia in the US. And her research lies at the intersection between historical sociology and IR, focused on East-West relations, history, and the future of world orders, right? Bringing novel conceptualizations of modernity, sovereignty, rising and declining powers, and as well a focus on understanding Turkish politics in a comparative perspective. Her research has appeared in many outstanding outlets, such as international organizations, American Political Science Review, International Affairs, International Theory, International Studies Quarterly, European Journal of International Relations, and many others. So it's a very, very impressive publication record that I recommend everyone to look for her other works if you're not familiar with it yet. She's also has wrote two books, After Defeat and Before the West, which is the topic of our discussion today, both of which made a very important intervention in the discipline, with another edited book in between that consolidates her contribution to the study of hierarchies, by bringing several scholars to debate that concept. I'll go to that very soon. Still in terms of her many accomplishments, she was last year received of the Koch Medal of Science, which is given to one of the one scholar of Turkish origin under 50 that has an outstanding contribution to its own discipline. And back to her first book, I think it speaks to the level of her contribution, in the sense that a book that shows right how the workings of hierarchies that shape the world as we know it, from three crucial case studies of Turkey, Japan, and Russia. And by doing that, the impact of that book invited a broader discussion about structured hierarchies and deep hierarchies in world politics, which Dr. Zarakol then consolidated by bringing several perspectives on hierarchies into a volume that was called Hierarchies in World Politics, published by Cambridge University Press. That set an agenda that has influenced many scholars, including myself, in studying several key concepts such as sovereignty and many others in terms of hierarchies. And her recent book, which is the topic of the discussion today, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, does something similar with a different focus, and I'll focus on bringing global history and concepts of IR together through notions of order and sovereignty, right? So the book re-theorized sovereignty, order, and decline from a global perspective that not only challenge the contemporary international orders from looking beyond the West, but also to the past of those societies. And I think this is a very important contribution that I will discuss more in after the talk. But at the same time, what I see it doing, in this talk is one example of that. It's paving the way to a broader discussion on order and its relations to key concepts of IR, such as sovereignty, across the discipline. So without further ado, I'll leave the word to Dr. Zarakol. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lucas, for that very nice introduction. And thank you, all of you in the audience, for taking time out of your day, especially on a Saturday, to come listen to my talk. And I know, of course, this is a very important week for Indian politics, so you may want to be talking about Indian politics, but instead we're going to do a journey into history, but with relevance, I hope, for modern day international politics. I have some slides. I'm going to share them. Just 1 second. Can you see the slides? Are they visible? Yes. Great. Okay, so as was noted by the two introductions, today I'm going to talk to you about my recent book, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. This book has been out for about 2 years now, but I'm still going around giving talks quite actively. So I've been very lucky to find readership around the world and in different communities beyond international relations, which is my discipline. And at each talk, the audience is interested in different parts of the book. So I will give you my general talk, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to lean into particular aspects of it if they spark your curiosity more. Now, let me start by explaining what I'm trying to do in the book, because as I said, I'm an international relations scholar. So why am I writing about history, you may ask? And that is because international relations as a discipline, while aiming to explain what's going on now, often gets its lessons or ideas about what's going on now from history. So, for instance, nowadays we debate power transition, potential decline of the US, rise of China, or we talk about, Russia's war on Ukraine. But how do we talk about these things? Generally, the scholars who theorize about what's going on have studied history So there's some classics books in my field, like The Rise and Fall of Great Powers by Paul Kennedy, or Theory of International Politics by Waltz, Mearsheimer, who's still alive. Well, Kennedy's also, but you've seen him maybe in the news talking about Russia and Ukraine. His book Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and all of these books are looking at history and looking at great power behavior in history. The trouble is, international relations, when it thinks of history, thinks of a very specific slice of history. So if you take an international relations class, or in the United States, but in general, and you encounter a textbook about international relations history, it will go something like, there was the Peloponnesian War, from which we get some ideas about power transition, Athens, Sparta. And then in 1648, there was the Treaty of Peace of Westphalia, concluding the 30 Years' War. This is supposed to be the moment of creation of the modern international order. And then there are some, key events like Congress of Vienna, World War I, World War II, end of Cold War. These are the historical episodes that international relations students are exposed to, and from which they're supposed to derive lessons that are supposed to explain international political behavior today and into the future. As I said, this is a very particular slice of history. It's very quiet about what happens between classical Greece and 17th century Europe. It's also very silent about what happens outside of Europe. It's as if nothing of importance or nothing that international relations scholars can learn from has happened outside of Europe ever. And the rest of the world doesn't come into international relations view until 19th century or 20th century and politics of decolonization. So they're not even, the rest of the world is not even, until recently, was not thought of as proper actors or agents in international politics. And if you're interested, as I am, in international order, that also has a very similar story. There's this idea that first there was no order anywhere, and then a regional order was created in the 17th century in Europe, the Westphalian order, and that was imported to the rest of the world by Europeans 18th, 19th century. Again, the assumption is the rest of the world was disconnected, did not have anything resembling international orders until the 19th century. Here's another slide expressing the same idea. So I think our students tend to assume that before Europeans came along, the rest of the world was in silos that resemble modern day nation states, and they were just doing their own thing, and then they were connected by European actors in very late in the day. That's the general assumption that international relations is operating with, that I wanted to challenge in this book. So what I'm trying to do is to write a new history for international relations that's not Eurocentric, that doesn't start in Europe, and tries to take into account more of world history. Of course, this is not complete. I've spoken to audiences in India before. I mean, I know you're not India, but connected to India. And sometimes they will say, what about earlier? And you may say after, because I'm going to start in the 13th century. And I would agree with you. There's much more of this story to be told. But I'm starting in the book for a non-Eurocentric history of international relations in the 13th century with the empire of the Mongols. Why do I start there? You may think it's because I'm from Turkey and I feel an affinity to the Mongols, but that's not the case. I swear, and I have a chapter in the book discussing that. It's not because of some kind of linguistic affinity. It's because the Mongol Empire in the 13th century played a similar role for Asian history as the Roman Empire did for European history. What do I mean by that? It was a moment of convergence of faiths for people, most people who lived in the space that we call Asia today. They were subjected to the same forces. And even those who escaped conquest by the Mongols were quite affected by what the Mongols did. As you know, there was migration into the Indian subcontinent, like refugees and so. So there was, even beyond the direct impact, there was indirect impact. So this is a moment. I think if you want, Europeans always start the story of Europe with Rome. So if we want to tell a story of Asia, this is one of the places we can start the narrative because it's a moment of convergence. And what I'm arguing in the book is that the Mongols, by subjecting the space to the same forces, essentially ordered this space in a similar way, connected this space after the brutal conquests were over. It became quite connected in a way that, of course, Asia was always connected, much more connected than we assume, even before the 13th century. But in the 13th century, it becomes really connected, thickly connected. And how do we know this? Because we can look at travelers, the story of travelers. Like, so for instance, Marco Polo is well known to global audiences. And people tend to assume, Marco Polo, a brave, intrepid explorer, going to a place nobody had gone before. But the reality is actually he was traversing a very, very well-established route, partly thanks to what was happening in the backdrop of the 13th century. But Marco Polo wasn't the only traveler. There are others you may be more familiar with. Ibn Battuta, and he's a little bit later, 14th century. He starts his life in Western North Africa, and for decades travels across Asia. And what's remarkable about his life story, which he goes back to his hometown and writes his memoirs, which we can read now. I talk about this in the book. Nobody's surprised to see him. It's not shocking, They ask for updates for previous places that he's been to. He's always able to find gainful employment and sponsorship as a jurist from the towns that he visits. To make a long story short, it seems like a very connected world, almost globalized. I think of this as kind of like my life story, having been born in Turkey and then going to the US, going to the UK, and I'm able to, do similar things. I talk to different audiences around the world. Why am I able to do this? Because we live in an ordered, connected, globalized world, thanks to, the backdrop of what happened in 19th, 20th century. And I think the 13th, 14th century, Eurasia was a similar place, thanks to as a result of, I shouldn't say thanks to, as a result of the Mongol conquests. So that's where I start the story. And I talk about how the world became ordered and connected in the 13th century, and how certain materials and goods and institutions and norms were diffused in this order, just as they are other ones are in our modern order. Again, a good example of things diffused is the dumpling. And even today, we can see in places subjected to this order, people enjoy like what is in English called a dumpling, but it has different names in different parts of the world, meat-filled dough. But in the book, I'm more interested in political ideas and institutions. And what I'm arguing is that a particular understanding of sovereignty was diffused across Asia. And this understanding of sovereignty organized politics for a long time and international politics also for a long time, from 13th century onward, especially in Asia, especially in Eurasia. So what is that understanding of sovereignty? In modernity, we have the nation state understanding of sovereignty. Sovereignty rests with like the nation. We have the state, we have territoriality, borders, and so on. In the 13th century, we're dealing with a different understanding of sovereignty. Again, it's centralized, so authority rests in the center, but the center is one person, as exemplified by Genghis Khan. So he's the the great conqueror, and he's above everything else. He's above religion. He makes the laws. He controls everything, at least in theory. Of course, in practice, that is impossible in the 13th century. But in theory, he controls everything. He makes all the rules, all the laws, and not subject to religious authority. And in return, he has to be a world conqueror. You may say, "Oh, isn't this just like monarchy?" It's not monarchy because, it's not garden variety monarchy, because by the 13th century. In most parts of the world, monarchies, kings were sharing authority with religious representatives of religion, whatever religion existed. So what is happening in the 13th century is a move by the politics side of that equation. Genghis Khan exerts himself over religion as well. And that becomes a very influential model, and we see it not just with the Mongols, but with people that were subjected to the same kind of Mongol rule for decades and centuries to come. So this makes this period comparable in some ways to modern day international relations, because just as we have great powers today in the 20th, 21st century, I'm arguing that in the 13th century onwards, we have great houses, essentially those who are influenced by the Chinggizid sovereignty norms. They pursue world conquest, world domination, so they're acting in ways comparable to the great powers of our day. And the book essentially talks about three world orders created by such great houses from the 13th century to the 17th century across Eurasia. I call them world orders. They're not international orders because we don't really have proper nations yet, but they are world orders because they aim to control and order all of the world. So the first one I mentioned, it's the Mongols, the empire of Genghis Khan, which then breaks into four pieces. So that's 13th, 14th century. Then that world order fragments, and the reasons for why I will discuss in a bit. Then that is replaced by an order that is constructed by the rivalry of, again, two great houses that are influenced by the Mongol Chinggizid model, but different. So just as, in our time, those states that decolonized were influenced by those who ruled them beforehand. Former colonies of the British Empire were influenced by the British Empire. So even those who rejected the Mongols were quite influenced by the rule that they were subjected to. So we see this in the case of China. So in China, the Yuan dynasty, which is Chinggizid Mongol, is overthrown and replaced by the Ming. But the early Ming end up acting very much like those that they rejected. So they exhibit, again, this type of very centralized, personalized rule that's interested in external conquest and recognition. You have the treasure voyages at this time. They exhibit a lot of interest in what is happening in Asia, but which is not traditional, Confucian Chinese approach. And so that's what we have in East Asia. And also in West Asia, you have the Timurids that are, of course, Timur much more self-consciously fashions himself after Genghis, so he's deliberately emulating. He's clearly influenced, whereas the Ming are indirectly influenced, but they're still and their rivalry over Asia constructs a world order, I argue, in the latter part of the 14th, early part of the 15th century. That is a bit like the Cold War order of the 20th century. You have one side rejecting the legacy rhetorically, you have one side embracing the legacy. So if you think US, USSR, vis-a-vis the European imperial legacy, but even those that reject exhibit features of what they were exposed and influenced to by before. So that's about give or take 70 years there of another world order, which then again fragments. And then we get to the 15th century. This time, the center of gravity has shifted to West Asia. And what I'm arguing is in the 16th century, you had 3 to 4 great houses that were very much in competition with each other, and they were influenced by these Chinggizid sovereignty ideas by way of Timur, by way of the Timurids, and they were ordering the world. So you have the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, and the Shaybanids to the north. I don't talk about them as much because the materials about the Shaybanids were very limited. But what I ended up writing is, if you we now tend to think of these empires as separate things, because we are exposed to two things. One is nationalist historiography. So if you're in Turkey, learn about the Ottomans. If you're in Iran, you learn about the Safavids. If you're in India, you learn about the Mughals, and so on. But and the other thing that we're exposed to is like Eurocentrism. So these empires are compared with Europe, or we are interested in their relations with Europe. But if you actually could time travel to 16th century, especially the early part, these great houses were actually very much connected to each other because they were formed, exposed to the same kind of influences, Islam on the one hand and the Chinggizid Timurid norms on the other hand, plus local cultural repertoires. And they were in competition with each other to be, this concept of Sahib Kran, the millennial sovereign. They were trying to create universal empires. They controlled, a third of the world's population between them and much of the world's economy. And a more proper understanding of 16th century world politics would talk about the relations between these 3 to 4 great houses than focus on Europe. Europe, of course, is on its way up at this point, but it's still, very much peripheral because this is where the world's wealth is, and also previously, as I discussed in the previous chapters. And I argue in the next chapter that Europe was also influenced very much by Chinggizid Timurid norms by way of Habsburgs. Habsburgs were competing with the Ottomans as a rising house, and they took some of the ideas of centralization and so on from the East. So it's kind of flips the traditional, these two chapters flip the traditional Eurocentric narrative on its head. Instead of assuming the history had always focused on Europe, I'm telling a story that comes out of Asia, that comes out of the East, and show how Europe was influenced by some of these Eastern norms and political practices. I also discuss Russia, who are part of the same world because they were also subject to Mongol rule, and also to discuss China and Inner Asia in chapter 5 as well. So that's kind of the general narrative of the book. I don't want to get into too much detail there. We'll see what strikes your fancy in the Q&A. But I'm telling a story of a particular sovereignty model understanding, operating, and organizing world politics of Eurasia from the 13th to the 17th century. It doesn't mean there aren't other influences, but this is a thread that's been overlooked. I think it's a common thread, something that is shared across Asia. And I also look at some of these secondary practices. So just as the nation state model came to us with a number of secondary practices that have nothing to do with the politics of it, but in order to modernize, westernize, people around the world ended up copying, European practices because they assumed these things went together. We have a similar effect in 13th to 17th century Asia. A number of secondary practices come in the package. So there's, wherever we see the influence of the Chingizids, the Mongols, there's extra interest in astrology, astronomy for that period, or like resurgence, let's say, of interest. Of course, there's prior histories of this. Tanistry, this practice of selecting the next ruler through infighting among eligible males of the ruling family. The Mughals had quite institutionalized this, so you may know it from there, as opposed to the eldest son inheriting. And that's essentially because you're selecting a world conqueror, because the model expects the ruler to be a world conqueror. First, you conquer your own family. Interest in hunting, symbolic and otherwise, and garden fascination with gardens, general promotion of cultural pluralism, let's say it. I mean, so there is in the Chingizid model, the rulers are quite uninterested in what their subjects believe, not because they are like great liberals, but because they see themselves as above everybody else, so they don't care. It's like, you don't care whether you're like cats or are like believe X or Y. So in the same way, like the Chingizid rulers and those who subscribe to this model tend not to interfere very much in the everyday practices of subjects. Of course, later, when there's conversion and the Chingizid model intersects, becomes hybridized with other models like Islamic authority or like Buddhism in the East and so on, like then some of those attitudes diminish. But in the original model, there's kind of a hands-off attitude towards cultural practices of the subjects. And promotion of trade, again, was part of this package. The Mongols invested, refurbished, and made safer what used to be called the Silk Road. They really facilitated trade across Asia, and the successor houses, states, also promote trade a lot. So that's what we see. Okay. Now, this narrative allows me to complement the existing international relations narrative, which starts in Europe in the 17th century, by telling stories of other international orders or world orders that existed before, and gives a much broader reading of the kind of world history that international relations could use to think about the present. And of course, as I said, this is not, this is only the beginning. We could add much more. What is the benefit of expanding international relations historical knowledge? What is the benefit of talking about world orders of the past? Really, I mean, as I said, anything we talk about today, we think by analogy, we look at history, we take lessons from history. So international relations has always debated rise and fall of great powers and power transition. That's because if you look at history only from 17th century onwards, it seems that the only thing that changes are great powers. So some great powers rise, some great powers decline. The fabric of international politics doesn't seem to change. But if you do what I do and go to the longer durée, think about world politics from a large, bigger perspective that's not Eurocentric, then it becomes possible to imagine the decline of things beyond great powers. So we could talk about decline of orders, which until recently international relations didn't imagine that our international order could itself decline. There was this idea that we're at the end of history, as you know. The international order was only going to get more global, and then there wasn't going to be anything after that. But if you think about long durée history, then of course orders can also decline. And in the book, I also talk about this idea of ecumene, like so very deep norms that organize our lives can also shift. For so much of the period I'm talking about in the book, the world was really centered in the East to the extent it had a center. Chinggisid family, connection to the Chinggisid family was very, very important. That charisma, these ideas of millennial universal sovereignty, very, very important. And then we kind of forgot about it all. Like that's the degree to which, so today we take our nation states, our concern for territory, the West-centeredness of the world for granted, but these types of deep norms can also decline and fragment. And the other thing this narrative allows me to do is to think about how orders and fragment. And that is something that I'm working on these days because I have this project on global disorder that's funded by the British Academy. And that comes out of this book, but I'm still working on it. Like, how do orders end? Again, international relations focuses very much on great power competition. But what I see from studying history is that orders generally do not end because of great power competition, because great power competition could actually reinforce order if the two sides or all sides agree on basic rules and norms and understandings. What seems to be particularly damaging to orders, at least historically speaking, are what I'm calling structural crises. So at the end of each period that I've just told you about, there are major material pressures that fragment political arrangements. So in the middle of 14th century, there's, of course, the plague, the Black Death. In the middle of 15th century, just to give an example, there's a contraction of a supply of precious metals, which really disrupts trade across Asia. And then, most interestingly, in the 17th century, which is a much longer crisis period and really spells, bad news for the East, is what historians call the general crisis of the 17th century. This idea of a general crisis in the 17th century was well known to historians of Europe. They've been studying it for about a century because when you look at European history, 17th century is particularly messy. You have the 30 Years' War, English Civil War, etc. But recently, we've become aware that 17th century was quite troublesome for much of the Northern Hemisphere. So you had the time of troubles in Russia, you have major rebellions in the Ottoman Empire. Again, you have the Ming overthrow in China. In the Indian subcontinent is an exception to this, partly because I think maybe the favorite explanation now is climate change. So historians now think the 17th century was so messy because it was a time of severe climate change. And here this chart expresses it crudely, but the 17th century was the coolest period of a longer cold period known as the Little Ice Age. So in the 17th century, from the end of the 16th to last quarter of the 17th century, the northern hemisphere is 2 to 3 Celsius cooler, very unpredictable weather patterns, very cold, which causes, of course, crop failures. And coupled with the 16th century population boom, that creates a lot of unrest among the general population in much of northern hemisphere. So you have rebellions and wars and all sorts of conflict in the 17th century. And what I argue is, the crisis, the general crisis of the 17th century, essentially caused all of the great houses of the time to turn inward. They had to deal with their internal problems, and you can think of even the 30 Years' War as kind of an internal conflict for the Habsburgs. And they essentially stopped engaging with each other and reinforcing the existing order. The 16th century order fragmented, became very regionalized, and then was reconstituted when order was reconstituted, it was by Europeans later in the 18th century. So that gave them an advantage. By the way, since Lucas is here and is from South America, I should note that some are arguing now that the very cold period of the 17th century was actually partially caused by the conquest of Americas, because that led to a population drop, almost 90% drop in population in the Americas, and reforesting as a result, abandonment of farmland and reforesting. And they think it's that reforesting of the Americas in the 15th, 16th centuries that caused the very cold period in the 17th century. So that was in some ways man-made climate change as well. So here's a European painting from that time with ice skating and so on, showing how cold that period is. So that's part of the story of how orders fragment, and we tend to think climate change is a specific problem for our time. But I think the 17th century and its impact on the Eastern world makes a nice analogy for the 20th century and maybe the Western order. The other part of the story that I'm referring to in the book and I'm continuing to work on are not just structural crisis, but legitimation crisis. And basically what I'm saying is every order has a way it legitimizes itself. So when we talk about the liberal international order, it promises certain things, right? Free trade, equal treatment, human rights, etc. When it starts contradicting its own promises, that creates a legitimation crisis. And accusations of hypocrisy and so on, which orders can survive. It's not deadly. Not every legitimation crisis is deadly. But when legitimation crises and structural crises come together, that is a problem. So in the orders that I'm looking at in the book from the East, they promised conquest. That's how they legitimated itself, right? These were supposed to be world empires. So when they stopped conquering, that created a legitimation crisis. So even if they were doing economically well, it was a problem. So for instance, when the Mongol Empire fragmented into 4 parts, they first fought each other because you cannot have 4 universal empires. By definition, it's a contradiction in terms. Then they settled into a peace, Pax Mongolica, and the peacetime was quite good. The trade was very good for trade. It was, economically they were doing well, but it still, the absence of conquest, having to coexist, was a legitimation problem. And this is when you start seeing the ruling houses convert to, especially in the West, to Islam, to try to legitimize their rule through other means. Anyway, I mean, coming back to what I was saying, it's when the two happens together, structural crisis and legitimation crisis, that it's a real problem. And I think that is what is happening in the 17th century for especially the Ottomans, and less so for the Safavids and the Mughals, but then they also get constrained by that. Even if they survive, what doesn't survive is the world order that is constituted through their rivalry and engagement with each other. So a couple of final words, and then I will turn it over to Lucas. In the book, I also talk about the politics of doing this type of macro history, the disciplinary politics, which I won't bore you with, but there are also real world politics of writing an account that starts of course with the Mongols. So I try to kind of deal with that in a reflexive way in the book. And I've also written a spin-off piece that came out in Global Studies Quarterly, remembering the shared history of Eurasia. So, I mean, one of the things that I also get asked when I do this talk is, well, first of all, were the Mongol conquests brutal? Yes, they were. So I'm not trying to be an apologist for the Mongols. They were very, very brutal. But at the same time, they did connect the world and influence Asia. So we have to remember that history. So, I mean, some historians argue that the Chinggisid exchange is similar to Columbine exchange in terms of how much it spreads stuff around the world. And the second thing that I get asked is, by talking about Chinggisid sovereignty model, this personalized sovereignty model, am I trying to excuse, centralized, personalized, autocratic rule in Asia? Am I arguing that Asia is more susceptible to this? And my answer to that is, I don't think any particular group of people are more susceptible to autocracy. I think this is something that comes up in different parts of the world under different guises. But of course, your historical repertoire, what you've been exposed to, plays a role in how easily the same pattern can manifest or not. But the way to deal with that is not to ignore certain elements of history, but to confront them. And I think one nice thing about writing a book like this for me has been to realize, for instance, as someone from Turkey, how much of a shared history there is between, Turkey and India, Turkey and China. All parts of Asia actually have been connected because they've been exposed to the same forces, for better or worse, in different time periods. And we've kind of completely forgotten that story. We've only focused on, the connections made by Europeans. And I think we really need to do more to recover shared elements. I mean, it's not just, of course, Asia, across the world, shared stories, so that we can, start rebalancing our understanding of both history, but also present day international relations. And I'll stop there. Thank you for, again, listening. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. So now, Dr. Lucas. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. No, thank you very much, Ayse. It was really nice to hear about the book. I had an opportunity to hear about the book. So what I'm going to talk is to comment a bit of the to comment a bit about the books, situate the books in terms of its contribution. I think Professor Zarakol already situated very well, but I think I can perhaps say something more. So I think one of the things that makes the book have such appeal in IR, but not only in IR, is the way it empowers, it enhances the power of historical analogies, right? By having a rich and very detailed study of political practices across such a long period and in a historical moment that has been very much overlooked by most social thinking of international relations in the discipline and beyond. The book allows us to think beyond our moment, right? And with that, it gives us critical tools to then engage with our moment, with the current moment of potential transformation in the way international relations and world politics unfold. So I think that is something that has, to me, when I read the book, and I think when I see the several reactions, when I see reviews, that's a common purchase that the book brings. And I think that has this broader, right, contribution of the book, this broader appeal of the book has a very important manifestation as a disciplinary contribution as well, right? It comes from within a process of within a path of international relations discipline, becoming more aware of the need to understand its historical past in order to better engage with the concepts it uses to analyze more recent events that are deemed as part of the same order, so to speak, that we live currently. And I think that this book has it's one of that does it with great mastery, right? By tackling two of the most central concepts that define what the way we live, which is order and sovereignty. And I think in terms of order, what's interesting is that the book also comes, and so it brings this historicizing of international relations as a whole with another discussion of self-reflection that part of the theory of the international relations discipline, even in its mainstream, has having about its object of study, right? And the study of orders has that component of trying to understand what makes the world as we live, as the world that we live as it is. And the key concept around that is the concept of liberal international order. That has been the perspective that we might be going through a moment of crisis of the liberal international order has triggered a huge debate about what is this such order, right? Where it comes from, is it universal, and several key questions around that. Which were only partially could only be partially explained by looking at the order itself, right? Trying to trace its origins, trying to see how it works, trying to see how it may change. What this book allows for is to invite us to think outside that order to understand how it works and how it may change. And it does so, I think, by looking at two at the same time concurrently at two moves of go beyond. The first move is going beyond the West itself, right? Looking at a reality that's not place centered on Europe, but does it more by not looking at only the non-European views of ordering and practice of ordering politics, after the so-called European expansion of international society, but actually by looking at a process that was before that so-called European hegemony. So I think that those moves are they are crucial to allow us to better understand order and its potential change in the way that Dr. Zarakol just introduced now. And I think if I can add, she mentioned several very important concrete ways that the book allows us to think about the current moment in terms of the combination of structural crisis and crisis of legitimacy. I think that's a crucial moment, a crucial aspect. I think I would add that one particular concept around about what we can think about this legitimation crisis now and its potential intersected structural crisis is the concept of democracy, right? I think that's the ability of democracy to deal with the several structural crises that are ongoing is probably one of the key challenges that we will have in our few decades. That's my personal view. But I think that more analytically, I would add also that one key aspect that the book brings about is the understanding process of orders as process of reassembling, right? By bringing together political societies, incorporating practice from those that are being incorporated, but also in merging those practices with those that are incorporating, right, the dominance. And that I think that's very clear in the process of constitution, the acumen around the Mughal Empire. And it's fascinating to understand then how process of fragmentation that we might be seeing, they reproduce that, right? They channel practice from one place to another place, and how those processes keep being interconnected, even in process of fragmentation. And I think that's something we, as we all the discussion about deglobalization we have today, and the potential need for both states, but also regions to progressively look more at their own dynamics rather than having a continuous globalization as it was the case throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. We might see that having important lessons to understand how it may work, which aspects of the current order will still be linking and shaping, interconnecting those potentially more fragmented world, and how that can be important to understand the specific dynamics that may occur in different parts of the world. So I see there are quite a few hands up, so I don't want to go much more, but I'm happy to keep part of the debate. It was really a pleasure to see the discussion to see Dr. Zarakol's book achieving a novel audience and novel readership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. And just before we go to question and answer session, this is just an announcement for coming Saturday. Coming Saturday, we have Dr. Pratinav Anil from University of Oxford, who is going to talk on a very elite betrayal, Muslim politics in post-colonial India, 1947 to 2024. And he is going to be joined by two very good scholars, one from Jamia Millia Islamia, Dr. Mujibur Rahman, for introductory remarks, and Dr. Hilal Ahmed for the concluding remarks. He is from CSDS from Delhi. So over to Mirza Faisal Beg for taking question answers, because today Dr. Rafat Hussain is not present here for he's traveling somewhere. So Faisal, try to.
Okay. Thank you for both the speakers. Let me go straight to the question answer sessions. I saw Dr. Nazir Ahmed has raised his hand earlier, but he has withdrawn. I'm not sure, Dr. Nazir, you still want to go, or let me allow. I'm allowed now. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm able to unmute. Thank you so much for this very illuminating lecture, a refreshing departure from the Eurocentric view of history. My question relates to the intellectual transformations that followed the Mongol period in the 13th century. And for brevity, I'll just focus on the Islamic world between Istanbul and Dhaka. The Mongol invasions did several things. Number one, they destroyed the Abbasid Khilafat, fostered decentralization, wherein we had centralization under the Khilafat, destroyed much of Central Asia and Iran, and then in the wake of the devastations emerged a Sufi Islam, an Islam that was dominated by Tasawwuf, which permeated the entire area from the Gangetic Plains to Anatolia. Specifically, the Safavid dynasty was a direct outcome of the rise of Tasawwuf. Mughal India was profoundly influenced by Tasawwuf under the reign of Akbar, and it held together certainly the Islamic world against the onslaught of the West until the 17th century. So my question now takes us to the end of the 17th century. Very rarely does human history offer the kind of pivots that we see between 1683 and 1690. Three major things happen on the global stage. Number one, Sir Isaac Newton publishes his laws of physics in Cambridge between 1684 and 1687. Number two, the Turks lose their battle of Vienna, 1684, and are forced to retreat onto Eastern Europe. And in India, Aurangzeb publishes his Futuwat-e-Alamgiri, taking Indian Islam away from Tasawwuf onto the rule-based type of Islam, from Taqwa from Fatwa to Taqwa. So my question, ma'am, is the following. To what extent were these ideational upheavals responsible for the decay specifically of the Islamic world, the Mongols, the Safavids, and the Turks?
Thank you for that very erudite question. I mean, I have to, think about it a little bit more. But I mean, the earlier events that you referenced, I do discuss in the book. I mean, so what? I mean, you said the Mongol invasions caused decentralization. I think that's true, maybe to some extent, from a religious perspective, but at the same time, they increased the power of political rulers. Prior to Mongol invasions of Islamic lands, as you say, there is the caliphate. The ulama are particularly strong, and then the kings or the rulers, they're the sword that protects the people, but they don't have lawmaking powers and so on. So with the Mongols comes in this idea that the rulers can actually make laws themselves, because Genghis is the lawgiver, he is the yasa maker. So that's a thread that we can see influencing Islamic houses all the way to Akbar, so and then I agree, there's a shift at the end of the 17th century. But it's not just with the Mughals, with the Ottomans too. There's a turn. I mean, so something does end up changing that dynamic. different direction. That's why my story also ends in the 17th century. But my explanation is that there's this larger structural crisis that is going on. And there's so much disorder for like decades and decades, especially, I'm more familiar with the Ottoman case, but in general, there's too much, noise in the system. There isn't rivalry anymore. They're not as focused on each other. So they're not reinforcing the existing norms and understandings. And then that allows for new modes of thinking, I think, to emerge and make their mark. So when I think about like the parallels between, the present day and the 17th century, that's what I think about. I think new ideas are, there could be, maybe there was a Newton, or the equivalent of Newton at another time, but new ideas, new ways of thinking are able to make an impact at a time where the old ideas have been weakened by other forces. So it's not just the strength of the new idea, but whether it can be heard or whether people are open to change because they've lost their attachment to the old order, the old ways of thinking. So that's how I would think about what's going on in the 17th century. So I agree with you, but I think there is also a macro story to be told in the background, which is what I focus on in the book. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Iram?
Thank you, Razi Saab and Dr. Zarakol. I want to ask Dr. Zarakol that the Eastern Order was a very vast, it prevails a very vast geography, and it encompasses most of the population. But today, can we see any legacy in political or socio-economic field in the modern world of this once vast Eastern Order? Thank you.
Yes. I had some difficulty hearing you at moments, but I think you were asking, can we see modern legacies of what I'm talking about in this geography? Yes. So I think historical legacies come by in two ways. One is, practices and institutions leave their mark. So, there's almost like a collective memory of doing stuff. At the same time, historical legacies play a role because existing governments or existing political systems tell particular stories and they reproduce, those practices and so on. So I think of the first kind, the kind of first type of indirect legacy just in the air, there is quite a bit across Asia. But in terms of the stories that are being told, the Mongol Chinggisid influence has been downplayed in across Asia in different settings for similar but also different reasons. But currently there isn't a government. Not even in Mongolia. That's I mean, of course there are symbolic references and so on, but at least the powerful states of our day don't want to tell this story of shared history. In fact, they want to kind of erase this. I mean, for the longest time, the Mongols were blamed for the destruction. I mean, going back to the previous question, they were blamed for weakening Islam. So in the Middle East, they were blamed for weakening Islam and the subsequent rise of Europe. And they were blamed for other things. I mean, it's not that they were not to blame. I mean, I do agree they did cause a lot of devastation. So I'm not necessarily standing up for them. But I think it's the shared history that needs to be remembered. So what kind of legacies? I mean, So one thing that I mean, there are many examples, but one thing that the Chinggisid model of empire promoted, as I said, was pluralism, general cultural and religious pluralism, which shifts, again, going back to the previous question, it starts shifting in the 17th century. But in places that experience this legacy, there's much more ethnic, linguistic, religious diversity compared to, especially to Europe. And it is actually that diversity that becomes kind of like a handicap or a disadvantage vis-a-vis the European nation-state model when we get to 18th, 19th century. And then you start seeing, in the name of modernization, a lot of very problematic political projects and that continue to this day, trying to suppress differences. I mean, not everywhere, but it's a trend across Asia. But it is actually, I think it's a good thing that there was more diversity, and that's a nice part of that legacy. I mean, not that, as I said, it's not because they were good guys, but because they didn't, meddle in that way.
Okay, thank you. Amir bhai, you're next.
I'm trying to start a video, but it doesn't allow me, but I guess it is not necessary. Thank you. I enjoyed the talk.
You can do so. Okay.
And I think you presented an excellent overall global view of the history of Mongols. But the problem I see is that to lump Mongols as a homogeneous entity probably is not advisable, because as you see, Turks, for example, they descended from a different tribe of Mongols, and the Mughals in India, they traced their origin to Temur, which is a tribe of the Mongols. Overall, if you consider what they have given the Mongols, initially, at least during Genghis Khan and his successors, they only gave destruction and bloodshed and devastation in vast areas of the world, Asia, of course. Even in later on, Temur, who descended on some tribe of Mongols, brought a lot of devastation. He claimed to be, and I'm sure he was a Muslim, but that didn't make any difference because he devastated the Muslim kingdoms and empires just as much and very, very brutally. Now, Turkey, much better than I do, as Seljuk tribes, they originally took over, and later on, present-day Turks descended from them, and Ottoman Empire did a lot of good work. I mean, especially the conquest to the Eastern Europe. India, Mughals did a lot of good work, but what we like to call Mongols, as such, I'm not sure they did much good to the world. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, you didn't go into details of that. That wasn't your theme or topic of your talk. But I like your comments. I mean, by and large, what we call Mongols, the period, was it benign or it was a curse to the humanity? Thank you very much.
Yes, so I'm not interested in well, I mean, of course you have to pass judgment, but it's one man's positive development is another man's curse, so there were those who benefited from that period and those that suffered greatly. So I mean, I think it really depends on your perspective. What I'm interested in is, did they have a ordering impact on the world? And I think they did. I mean, it's the same thing with European colonialism. It ordered the world, and then many really suffered from that and continue to suffer from that. But it is an undeniable fact that this is something that ordered the world for decades and centuries. So the Mongols are the same. So it's not about saying the Mongols were great. It's just that this conquest changed the world, the effects of which we can trace for a long time in different settings. And that common shared legacy is something that needs to be remembered because it connects and ties different parts of the world and Asia to each other. So that's all I'm saying. And I agree. I mean, the Mongols, I use the word Mongols when I speak to general audiences because it's more familiar. But really, it's not about Mongols as an ethnic group or a national group. It's really about the Chinggisid family, the dynasty, and the same thing with the Mughals, the Gurkhani and the Ottomans. They were a family. They did not have really national or ethnic consciousness, and they often ended up, the ruling families, as you know, like changed even the language they spoke over time, because their loyalty was to the family, not not to the people. You could be a Mongol speaking peasant and you would be like slaved, common fodder. Like they didn't care about you, more than they did. It's really about the family. It's about the house rather than any kind of ethnic or national grouping. And of course, religious conversion we cannot really, we don't have the means to question, but the loyalty to the family first and foremost continues beyond conversion. And of course, but even the loyal to the family, like in the sense that the family is eligible to rule, but then of course they don't have a problem killing each other either. So that's when they're fighting. So that's a completely different understanding of the world that seems quite.
I thought you had been very generous and kind to the Mongols. Maybe that was not the subject of your concern, but maybe if you could include sometime part of your talk that the devastation with the world was visited upon by Mongols took a long time to recover from, especially Genghis Khan, his successor, Hulagu Khan. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah, I mean, I usually don't talk about it because everybody knows that part. So I'm trying to convince that there was other stuff. But yeah, sure. Yeah, don't tell about.
All right. Thank you. I don't have any hands yet, so I'll go by some of the questions that were posted in the chat. If anyone else has questions, please raise your digital hand. In the meantime, Shrikant Chopra is asking, how did different amalgamations of Mongol model with Buddhism in China and Islam in West Asia cause different political and cultural outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a bit hard to compare because the Buddhism experiment is, well, as a ruling experiment is a short one because the Yuan dynasty is less than a century, but the amalgamation with Islam like ends up, having several modes and branches. Starts with the Golden Horde, Ilkhanate, and then you have the Timurids, and then of course the later houses, the Ottomans, and so on. So the amalgamation there is much more successful in a way. I think it may have to do with Islam also having, I mean, not that Buddhism isn't, but Islam also having like a universal vision and being tied with conquest from like the time of Muhammad. So it's a relatively easier friendship, well, or amalgamation with the Chinggisid model. But of course, it's, there are also contradictions. So when we see, in Islamic Chinggisid and post-Chinggisid dynasties, there is often a tension with the rulers who subscribe more to the Chinggisid model of understanding of sovereignty, the personalized centralized rule, versus the more devout rulers. Because essentially in the Chinggisid model, the ruler is the sovereign, whereas in Islam, Allah is the sovereign. You cannot have like a ruler on earth claiming all these, lawmaking powers. So for instance, like with the Timurids, Timur is a Chinggisid type of sovereign. He's a conqueror. Shah Rukh Khan, after him, is a more devout kind of ruler, more, like restrained as a way. But that creates problems because the more devout Islamic rulers are not as interested in conquest and centralization, so then they face legitimation problems from that side. That's the Islamic variant. And then I in the book I discuss like the ways it evolves, the model evolves. I don't discuss in the Islamic side. As I said, with the Buddhism side, we don't have as much data in a way because it was a more short-lived experiment. But in some ways, Buddhism was not as easy a fit, even less so than Islam, I think, for the Chinggisid model.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Ayse. The discussion around the New World Order or international relations doesn't include the Asian world orders. What are the theories used to explain this historical illusion?
Thank you. From my namesake, well, there are no theories. It's just like Lucas can also support what I'm saying here. We just don't, people just didn't talk about it, didn't talk about any other part of the world. It was always the same standard 17th century to the present narrative, Westphalia, the Dutch, the British, France, Britain, the Congress, the Concert of Europe, then you have, so it's just, we never talked about it. So lately, because China is rising, there's been an interest in the Chinese model. So people talk about the tributary system, for instance, but even that is, quite problematic and limited because it's as if China was an island and, the tributary system is, of course, kind of pushed by the present day Sinocentric views of, that emanate from China, of Chinese history. So partly I wanted to write an account that didn't privilege any part of the world, even though I was, previously warned for maybe being too kind on the Mongols. I mean, the Mongols are not a present day threat, right? It's like, so Mongolia is not going to take this story and, go on a spree of world conquest again. But actually, present day states beyond Europe have sometimes very problematic readings of history. And at times when we're trying to correct Eurocentrism, we open the door to other types of centricisms. And that's one of the things I'm trying to counter in this book beyond Eurocentrism as well. Yeah. But no, it was never explained by a theory. It was just like, oh, nothing of interest ever happened anywhere else except Europe. That was kind of the default assumption.
Thank you. Next question is from Surinder Agarwal. Excuse me.
I think there is another question before. It was a direct message to me. There is a question.
Go ahead and take the question and answer it.
Yes, this is from Salman Qureshi about, so he says, have you come across Peter Turchin's recent book called End Times? The book argues that empires usually have a roughly 200-year cycle of rise and fall. The fall is due to mainly two factors: elite overproduction and competition, and economic immiseration or great economic inequality. Peter Turchin thinks Mongol dynasty lasted a little less because of polygamy that led to more offsprings and more competition. I've heard of Peter Turchin. I haven't read this book. What I would say is I think like the study of empire is also quite Eurocentric. We tend to take the European empires as models and, primogeniture mode of succession and so on. So I would have to see if he is doing that. I think it depends on, again, like what your model is. As the Chinggisid model and the successors empires, they selected with tenestry, like they selected successors with tenestry. So again, the eligible males fight for the throne. There is a period of interregnum. They fight each other. They kill brothers or uncles and so on, which sounds horrible. But at the same time, if you have a ruling model that's based on personal rule, like a strong personal ruler, that's kind of like a rational way of selecting for that. and then if you change, then you may not be selecting for that type of ruler. So the Ottomans, which is one of the longest surviving dynasties, so that's from about 13th century to the 20th century, you have the Ottoman house existing and governing, and they shifted the succession model about halfway through. So they were able to survive beyond that, but actually there is the mode of the empire also underwent a change. It became much more bureaucratized, much less centralized. So you have to change the way you're selecting the ruler. Anyway, it was an interesting question, so I think I'll have to look up that book. Yeah.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Surinder Agarwal, says, what was the role of technology in shaping the world order you are talking about? Today, technology is a great driving force of structuring world order. A role of soft power versus hard power.
Yeah. So, I mean, I talk more about the ideas here, but of course, there's the world. This world has a materiality, and when you're talking from 13th century to 17th century, we may say like there's no technology, but actually anything is really anything can be technology. So if it's for that time, like what we call technology, it didn't exist, but that period had its own technology of connection. So I mean, one thing, if you're talking about like methods of warfare, like archery or like particular types of stirrups, like scholars have looked into this, or how like the postal system was maintained, the YAM as it was called, connecting different parts of Asia, like how communications were relayed. Again, we're talking about a huge space, but it was connected, which requires technology. That's not my area of expertise, but definitely there's a materiality to this world. It wouldn't have been possible without that. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't have any further question. There's a question asked by Dr. Iram, but Dr. Iram wants to probably ask herself. You want to go ahead, Dr. Iram? Oh, I see Abdul Jabbar has raised hand. So you'll be next, Dr. Abdul Jabbar.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask Dr. Ayse. There was the Arab order before the setting up of Turkic order. May I ask what is the reason for choosing the Turkic order from the 13th century as the topic of your book? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One is I was originally working on the Ottomans and their understanding of sovereignty, and I started reading that this notion of Kanun, Yasa can be traced back to the Mongol conquest. So I became interested. If the Mongols could influence the Ottomans many centuries down the line, they must have influenced others, and I wanted to tell a story of Asia, like talk about China. As I said, I don't want people to think of China as an island. How can I tell a connected story that has Russia in it, Turkey in it, India in it, China in it, go back to the Mongols, and then you kind of span out from there, and that allows you to do that. So it has like present day resonance. So that's part of it. And then of course I wanted to connect to Westphalia, like the traditional IR account. I wanted to challenge and complement that. So that's what's driving it. As I said, you could pick up different time periods, different orders. I think international relations should do that. I mean, I think the more we add, like somebody should write the story of Americas before European conquest. I mean, all of this is very, very important. Not just like, oh, isn't this an interesting history, which historians point out, it's important to know, but also the more examples of orders we have, the more examples of different modes of sovereignty we know about, the better we can like theorize what's going on, and also maybe think about the future, because the future is not going to look like the 20th century. And if you want to kind of imagine what the future will look like, it's good to have as many historical examples you can think with. because there are not infinite possibilities. So what's coming next will be some kind of version of what has existed before, even if it's not going to be the 20th century. Yeah, so I don't have a problem with others doing other parts. This is just where I kind of pulled the thread. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul-Jabbar.
Okay, great, fantastic talk. I have a question regarding if I correctly understood that. This is the crisis, the 17th century temperature crisis was untouched in India. Was there any reason for that kind of exclusive effect on the Indian subcontinent?
I don't know. I mean, this is very understudied. I mean, only recently historian, because when people thought about the 17th century crisis, they used to think it had political causes, or maybe it was caused by, the Spanish price inflation, the silver influx from Americas or something. There were different, and I think those were parts of it too. But only recently, because we focus on climate change, historians started thinking, oh, maybe it was climate change in the 17th century too. So it's a very recent area of study, even though if it's about the 17th century. So I don't think much has been done on the impact on the Indian subcontinent. At least I haven't found it. I was thinking, just from my own research, again, I'm in the beginning of this project, that part of the reason, that's the time where the Mughals really go into the subcontinent. So I think they were being pushed by maybe some of the same forces, difficulties of weather further up north. But again, I don't know. If you know anybody who's looked into it, please let me know. Again, hopefully more people will look into this, and then we'll put together a more comprehensive picture of what was going on in the 17th century in terms of climate and its impact. Also, there's very little data on what was happening in the southern hemisphere. So if we could, fill part of that puzzle, that would be great as well.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
All right. I have another hand here now. Ayse?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, my question was, you hinted upon something in your talk, the idea of a world order beyond US hegemony, US imperialism, in fact. And this idea has been worked on. There are several books on this topic. Perhaps you have done a prequel to it by taking a historical perspective primarily, which is indeed, and it was an honor to listen to you, since it has made many things clear in my mind about how Asia functioned before the current political system of nation state. May I ask you a question? You cited one of the reasons, you said that one of the reasons for the decline of an empire would be self-contradictory behavior. So would you or would you not like to comment on this further?
Yes.
It's your choice. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to imply, as I said, I don't think it's necessarily deadly, but it causes a perception of decline. So if you have a narrative of, we govern because we promise X, and I think all orders have this. And then if you stop doing that, then you're not living up to your own promises, and then it creates an internal discussion about, oh, this is a decline. So when the models that I'm discussing, like the Chinggisid model based on conquest, anytime conquest stopped, it was a problem for the Ottomans as well. The moment conquest stopped, even if everything else was going well, the intelligentsia of the time started saying, we are in decline. The system has become corrupt. The people are too comfortable. They've become soft. They're like too decadent. They're no longer warriors on the field. So because that was the standard by which they were measuring their rulers. So that creates, internal perceptions of decline, debates around decline, and then if that debates about decline also meet structural crisis, other like things that are undermining the power, then the two, I think the combination of the two is quite dangerous. So that's, I mean, again, the part about decline and disorder is something I'm working on now, so I haven't, fully figured it out, but I think of it, analogous to the predicament that, West finds itself in now. There is a contradiction, like not living up to, the liberal international order is supposed to be, as I said, egalitarian, but there are actually hierarchies, especially social hierarchies. There was always, difference between the West and the rest. Different standards apply to, Western countries versus others. So that was always a complaint in the global South. But then now there are also material pressures, again, climate change or the economic gap closing and, technological stuff that's happening. And the two together, it's probably quite dangerous for Western hegemony.
So can I ask a question, contemporary question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So you started this your talk, what we Indians feel about democratic experiment currently happening. So remarkable. So how can you briefly talk about India and Turkey in the contemporary political context? It's something I'm trying to take you to the 21st century.
Yes, in my general opinion, or like in the context of the book?
In the context of you understood the complexity of these two nations, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Democratic traditions, experiment. How do you see it?
I mean, I think, well, it's a big question. I have to think about it. I mean, in the context of the book, I mean, I've talked about this before, but it was quite eye-opening to me to realize how much of a shared history there is, and I discussed this episode in chapter 4, where I went to this Islamic art museum in Copenhagen, of all places, and then it was the first time I saw Islamic and Mughal and other, Ottoman and Mughal and Safavid art exhibited together. That was not, and just by theme, as opposed to national divisions. And then it made me realize, how connected these worlds were. Of course, not identical, but connected. And that is only possible, in the context of a century where, especially the intelligentsia, the artisans, the craftsmen, they were circulating between these courts. And that's, again, that's, of course, then, there's a divergence of fates from the point on after my book ends. India is subjected much more violently to European colonialism, whereas the Ottoman Empire kind of, escapes that fate, but not fully. It's and then it kind of ends up self-colonizing in a way in the 19th, 20th century. This is something that I discuss in my first book, After Defeat. There's a question here, by the way, about Said's Orientalism. Is this relevant here? Those ideas of social hierarchies, East-West relations from 19th century onwards, something I dealt with in my early part of my career, especially, like this notion of stigmatization, internalization of feelings of inferiority vis-a-vis the West, etc. So those are themes that I've written a lot about, not from a Saidian perspective, but similar, comparable. So that's, again, similar, comparable fates, but different trajectories given immediate experiences. I think India was more successful in preserving its cultural diversity than the Turkey. Well, maybe because of the loss of the Ottoman. Anyway, it's a very long story. Coming to the present day, again, I think the fates are quite similar. I see a lot of similarities between Erdogan and Modi. I was just telling someone that India in 2024 reminds me of Turkey in 2015, like in terms of political developments. Anyway, I mean, there's much to say, but I do think there are some parallel stories there, definitely.
Thank you. Great.
And I asked a question, Dr. Zarakol, completely unrelated to your topic, current topic. Turkey is a nation state now, and has there any studies been that the current Turkish nation, how much Turkish they are compared to when they started Anatolia? Reason I say is that during the Ottoman days, there was so much intermarriage, Eastern Europe, a lot of women were brought in. So it will be interesting that how much the Turkish nation now is really Turkish.
Well, really, I mean, certainly everybody is Turkish speaking, but yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier about the Mongols. I mean, the Mongols were not a Mongol people; they were the Chingizid house. The Ottomans were not, you know, Turkish people coming. They were like kind of a ruling group. I mean, the very early Ottomans, you know, in the fighting forces, they were like Christians. I mean, it was like everybody like was kind of fighting under them. So it's not a story of like Turks coming. It's a story of relatively small in numbers people coming, but then, you know, linguistically, and then you know, anyway. So Turks today, I don't know what really Turkish is, but they're a mixture of all sorts of things, as it happens in an empire, and yeah, but they speak Turkish, yes.
So one can watch the drama Insurrection, Ertugrul's
yes. Oh, is it called Insurrection in Turkey? Yeah, yes.
to see all this,
yes,
how the consolidation and all those things.
Yeah.
I have one question at the end, if nobody else has. When at the peak of Ottoman Empire and the Indian, like Mughals, I mean, really, they were having a lot of influence in the world, or at least trade, wealth, and all those. Everybody was coming to, at least in India, a lot of Europeans were coming. And they were exposed, the Mughals and the Indians were exposed to this idea that Europe is developing technology and they are, you know, really advancing on science and all those. This is a question that is really fundamental to our going down, that why, same happens to Ottoman also. Why did they lose on these fronts? Or why they never develop any curiosity to develop themselves on that level, or at least compete with them on any level? When they had all the wealth and all the resources.
I mean, these are questions that also fascinate me, and I try to deal with a little bit in the book, and probably will study for the rest of my career. But I think there is, you know, when you're on top, and you're accustomed to being on top and wealthy and powerful, you're not on the lookout for like new technologies or new ways of doing things. You're like actually think that what you've done has worked for you, so you kind of want to keep that going, also in times of crisis. I mean, I think that's the problem with like Asian great houses. That's what ended up happening to them. When they faced crisis, they tried to turn to their old ways, whereas the Europeans, they were not coming from like a great glorious past. I mean, if you look beyond the Roman Empire, so they were more, you know, they had to be you know, more open to, they were more open to change. Also certain coping technologies that they came up with for the difficult terrain that Europe was for much of the period that I'm talking about ended up being quite advantageous in the 17th century and onward. So one example is like insurance, for instance, again, it kind of technology, developed to deal with shipwrecks, because shipping was always very dangerous. Overland trade was preferred for centuries across Asia. It's slow, but these are relatively politically stable areas. They're relatively safe. So overland trade is much better than shipping in general, if you are willing to wait a certain amount of time. So 17th century overland trade falls apart, partly because of, now we think climate change, partly because of political turmoil. Shipping suddenly is less risky. Europeans have developed methods like insurance to deal with risk, which Asians don't have. And I mean, that's just to give one example. And then also, of course, like the ocean-going ships that Western Europeans have also became more advantageous compared to the Mediterranean ships. So, I mean, so why is somebody open to new technology or not, or like new ideas or not? I think it also has to do with what you're coming from, how desperate you are. I mean, we can see now, like, Western states are quite attached to the 20th century of way of doing things, because that's a century that really worked for the US and Europe. They have difficulty letting go of certain ways of looking at things, whereas the rest of the world is more open maybe to the disorder of 21st century, because they're not so attached to the 20th century. They're looking forward maybe to things improving for them. Yeah.
So do you think that Europeans who were coming to India, suppose, like Portuguese or the British and all those Englishmen or French, they were more desperate and Indians were more content at the time?
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. Especially in the beginning. I mean, that my colleague Jason Sharman has written a book on this called Empires of the Weak. Initially, the Europeans in Asia were really quite weak and desperate and, in supplicant roles. And the Asians didn't take them seriously at all because they were no threat.
Yeah, they came as traders, of course. They were
Yes.
defended, but the idea was that they probably realized that these big empires are really have a soft belly. You can beat them very easily. And look at the Mughals; they didn't have even the navy with such a big power, and
because maritime competition was not as important at that time. That's what I'm saying. Like, we have to evaluate political action by the standards of its time. So it's a projection of later maritime competition that we expect from the Mughals. They're coming from a different place. Of their oceans were the steppes. They're thinking like inner Asians. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, good discussion, I believe, and we have learned and we have given you some input, if probably. And I wish more of other people joining elsewhere joined here. But was overall a very good session. And thank you. It is almost 2 hours.
Thank you.
We covered almost 2 hours, and this is the time to say bye, goodbye. Or not goodbye, maybe we will engage you again.